Hello, my name is Cami Rincon, and I'm the Research Assistant in Public Sector AI Ethics and Governance at the Alan Turing Institute. Today I'll be speaking about my research titled Speaking from Experience, Trans and/or Non-Binary Requirements for Voice AI. I conducted this research alongside Oz Keys, PhD candidate at the University of Washington, and Dr. Corinne Cath, doctoral graduate from the Oxford Internet Institute. Here's a quick overview of what I will be covering today. Voice-activated AI is a technology that's understood as increasingly ubiquitous, with its most widely distributed form being voice assistants such as Siri or Alexa. Its increase in adoption has triggered much research into voice AI as it reinforces cultural norms of gender inequality. However, trans people have been greatly omitted in both academic and industry discussions of the potential gender-based harm of voice AI. The few exceptions of work which have attempted to include trans people in voice AI, have mostly incorporated frameworks of genderless voices without further inquiring into the needs of this community. In other words, they have centered user-facing representation and overriding the opportunity to address other potentially more salient issues that trans people may have with this technology. Speaking from experience sought to fill this gap of trans studies into voice AI and scrutinized assumes needs that trans people may have within voice AI. I first undertook this research as my master's thesis and then built on the work alongside Oz and Corinne. So we conducted a series of qualitative and semi-structured interviews with trans and non-binary users to identify their needs and experiences. We focused on users of Alexa, Siri, and Google Assistant. Interviews covered participants' gender, their use of voice assistants, their perception of trans competency in design, as well as their trust of voice assistants. And our research approach was informed by grounded theory methods. I'll now touch on the findings within our research. These findings shows that trans need exceed simply improvements to representation, and that users, in fact, raise substantial concerns around the privacy and safety implications of voice AI. They also raise concerns around the underlying approach to gender by developers, as well as the motivations of the vast for-profit companies that deploy much of this technology. Diving into this theme of representation, when discussing current forms of representation, 13 out of 15 participants were negative about the representativeness of their voice assistant's persona. 11 explicitly stated that their voice assistants were not designed for them. When discussing genderless frameworks for voice, most participants were positive about the idea of a genderless voice option in voice assistant systems. However, this form of representation was also critiqued for its inadequacy in reflecting trans people by binding voice to gender. Participants proposed alternative forms of representation, all of which centered flexibility. Even forms of representation that were perceived as competent were not always seen as important. Some participants didn't find representation relevant, and others expressed concerns. Participants also expressed desired features within voice AI, although somewhat reluctantly. They suggested features including supporting trans healthcare, connecting users to trans-related products and content, and supporting them in navigating safety in public spaces. Gender affirmation through language was noted as a requirement by most participants in the event that voice assistants develop conversational capacities that intersect with users' gender. Suggested features were discussed alongside tensions regarding the dangers that voice assistants pose for trans people in practice. In fact, all 15 participants voiced concerns about their devices. I will now touch on some of the tensions discussed by participants. The first theme is distrust in developers. All participants expressed feeling distrustful of the developers of their voice assistants. They touched on their motives, ethics, as well as concerns with the greater structures within which developers operate. They noted capitalism, patriarchy, and white privilege. Participants touched on concerns with anti-trans and other oppressive ideologies being exacerbated by being embedded in the design of voice assistants. Potential approaches to address these concerns, however, come in tension with other forms of distrust described by participants. Many participants were worried about who had access to their data and what companies did with that information. Although most participants noted gender competency as a need and increased conversational capacities, only 7 participants were willing to provide more detailed data about their identity in order for developers to enhance voice assistants' capabilities to understand their gender. Participants discussed concerns with trans people being visible to developers, touching on fears that this could trigger an increased vulnerability to corporate manipulation, and trans people being outed and targeted, among others. These fears and data visibility span broader than developer communities, however. Participants mentioned fears of third parties, including those wanted to harm trans people as potential entities that could access their personal information, noting white supremacist organizations, gender-critical feminists, as well as law enforcement. The subject of navigating safety concerns was significant for participants, both in online and offline spaces. Being visible as trans was often described as a complex relationship closely related to safety. The ability to pass as cisgender, for example, was discussed as a characteristic that enabled some participants to blend in at the cost of their identity becoming invisible. The subject of safety informs both the day-to-day lives of participants as well as their relations to voice assistants. Participants discussed a high level of discomfort experienced regularly and in most spaces. They also discussed a minority of safer spaces that offered a buffer from mainstream hostility. Safer spaces were characterized by having intentional frameworks that support the welcoming of marginalized identities, as well as operating with trans-competent notions of gender. Feelings of safety were often described as emerging from relationships with queer people and trans people, as well as queer and trans spaces. The centrality of communication, community, and relationships to participants' experiences of safety speaks to the complex relationship they have with voice assistants. These technologies were designed for communication, yet are constructed outside of spaces where participants feel like their safety and comfort are a priority. In the absence of the grounding of voice assistant design in such priorities, some participants saw representation and trans competency as a threat. Against this backdrop of tensions, participants described a range of design requirements, including transparency, control over data, and community-based development as sources that would increase their trust. I'll now touch on the themes in our discussion. So touching on the theme of intricacies of inclusion, standard designs of voice assistant personas reinforce frames of gender that underpin discrimination experienced by trans people. Addressing this through genderless voice frameworks continues to attribute gender to specific voice ranges and thus fails to promote trans competency. Even if competency is achieved, our results show that representation can be seen as a surface level approach that obstructs the addressing of more salient issues. Developers share data with third-party skills developers and have shared data with government officials. None of these entities have been described as safe, and as participant 14 described, may have crossed a line into trans people's safer spaces, at least partially through voice assistants. In such an environment, it's no surprise that our participants view these technologies as risky and efforts at inclusion as potentially dangerous. Touching on trans-specific vulnerabilities, incorporating trans representation without addressing their privacy concerns may serve as a surveillance trap that exploits trans people's specific hardships around safety to lure them into intimate adoption. And considering that participants describe most environments as hostile, the threat of privacy breaches may actually be felt in specific and acute ways by trans individuals. In conclusion, there are trans-specific vulnerabilities to representation. This is the case both in data and in user-facing design. We hope that concerns raised by trans people in this study halt shallow representational interventions. We have more precise design recommendations for people seeking trans inclusion in this area, and I'll welcome questions about them within the Q&A of our live paper session. Thank you.